Alright, we're back, small technicals. But, this is Mashako, aka Brother Oxy. I'm with my brothers, Brother Noms, aka Uriah, he's gonna make an introduction to himself. And I got Brother KW here with me. And we're reading chapter 2 of True Myth Black Vikings of the Middle Ages by Nasheed Al Amin. Brothers, the floor is yours.
Yeah, there's Noms over here, aka Uriah, Flame of the Most High, or Flame of Yahweh. I'm gonna give it up to KW.
Alright, what's up, y'all? We're back for the beginning of chapter 2. Let's get it.
Chapter 2 The Great White Forest. As far as commonly known, there are no written records between the periods. There are no written records of the periods between 12,000 BC, when Grimaldi's supposedly vanished, and 6,000 BC, after agricultural societies had sprung up along the great rivers which saw the emergence of the earlier civilizations, the Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, and Indus. The millennia between 12,000 and 6,000 BC seems to have been the haziest period for scholars and scientists to accurately decipher. Although a number of Western historians have commented on this period with seeming assertiveness, by this time humans had differentiated into three basic races: Negroids or Australoids, dispersing Grimaldi's in Europe and Southern Asia, a Mongoloid race or type in Central Asia, related to Australoids, and a Caucasoid or white type in Eurasia, a territory north of the Caucasus range between the Black and Caspian Seas, comprising what is today the southern portion of Russia. The boundaries of the territory might have extended northward to the vicinity of Moscow, eastward to the Ural River, and westward to the Desna River in the vicinity of Kiev. Let us consider these boundaries the primary region of Caucasoid evolution. There may have been several smaller white forest areas, but the area whose boundaries are outlined above will henceforth be referred to as the Great White Forest in this work. There is often disagreement among scholars as to the age of this or that monument, the race of this or that people, the year or the year this or that Egyptian dynasty, and even those were considered and even those we consider experts in any particular discipline are often not in accord even when considering the same artifacts or information. Many of those who discuss Grimaldi man or Cro-Magnon Negroids at all state that this earliest human vanished after 12,000 BC, but he, beginning his migrations out of Africa at least 100,000 years ago, was the first true human being anywhere, so it would seem logical that all other human beings anywhere on earth had to come from him. Therefore, how could he have vanished a physical entity while mankind still survived? He did not vanish. His culture, which once spread around the earth, perhaps became outdated and did not allow him to dominate the areas he once had. Later types of men evolving out of Grimaldi man, along with later migrants from Africa, modified and improved upon the older culture, superimposing a newer culture in the new areas that Grimaldi man had once dominated. Humans would continue to evolve, bifurcating into new types of men, initially perhaps in Africa, but also in the areas they had settled in outside of the mother continent, and like Grimaldi man before him, spread around most of the earth. Humans were still black skinned, but over many millennia would differentiate into still other types in the areas of the earth they eventually populated, and for long millennia all humans remained black skinned and brown. Somehow white humans evolved, and most Western scholars and scientists attribute the emergence to dark-skinned people spending many millennia in the cold northern regions of Asia and Eurasia. These regions, the analysis contend, offered less direct sunlight in the near Arctic weather conditions during a time when warm glacial ice still blanketed the northern regions of the planet. To survive the climate, dark-skinned humans lost their ability to produce melanin, the pigment in the body responsible for dark complexions, hair, and eye color, which prevents the body from absorbing the sun's UV rays. This adaptation, the analysis contend, the whiter skin, lighter hair, and eyes allows the body to absorb nutritional benefits from diminished direct sunlight, and this genetic adaptation is what most Western scientists contend produced over untold millennia the people we refer to as Caucasians. However, this long asserted scenario may be partially true, but is not the only explanation for the emergence of Caucasoids. There is no universal agreement as to when humans lost the ability to produce melanin, but living in a cold, sunless climate is not the only prerequisite for the genetic disorder called albinism or albinoism to take place. The theory of this writer and others who will be mentioned is that a significant outbreak of albinism took place in humans in some long ago epoch, leading to the emergence of the so-called Caucasian race. A cold, sun-starved climate was not necessary for this to occur, and what will be outlined below seems far more reasonable than the commonly accepted explanation, which, in all honesty, is nothing more than an oft-repeated theory. Why this mass albinism began is not precisely known and may not necessarily have begun in frigid northern climes. Albinism could have begun and indeed occurs in warmer climes, and Charles S. Finch in The Evolution of the Caucasoid (African presence in early Europe) makes it clear that albinism is a well-documented disorder in Africa in which the body is unable to produce melanin, leaving the skin and hair a stark white to whitish yellow, the irises of the eyes a gray-blue. It has long been conjectured that the ancient Libyans were a light or near white-skinned people strongly opposed to the rule of Egypt immediately to the east of the territory. In Egyptian hieroglyphic wall paintings, Libyans are often depicted as white-skinned and have been described as a Semitized Negroid people. As states James Brunson in The African Presence in the Ancient Mediterranean Isles and mainland Greece, who notes that of the earliest settlers of Crete are recognized as Libyans of North Africa. Sheikh Anta Diop in The African Origin of Civilization alludes to the whiteness of Libyans, citing 18th century historian Cornelius de Paul, who states that in the delta region surrounding the future Alexandria, Egypt was almost saturated with foreign white colonies. Arabs, Libyans, Babylonians, and Jews, that the delta region of Egypt became heavily populated by light-skinned or white people is well established, but Caucasian penetration and colonization of North Egypt and the spillover of Caucasian into Libya was a much later historical development in Egyptian history, occurring after invasions of supposedly Caucasian peoples from the Near East and from Greece, who intermixed with or drove away the indigenous black-skinned inhabitants who would have lived there. Eurocentric Western historians have exploited the presence of Caucasians in northern Egypt and Libya to imply that Caucasians were indigenous to North Africa. Western historians have taken every opportunity to declare a population or civilization white or Caucasian, even if the civilization or population was black, a point that will be expanded upon later. If Libyans were white or near white, it is probable that this was the result of a significant albino population and that Libya was a white forest area in North Africa. Chancellor Williams, in The Destruction of Black Civilization, assures us Libya was once so nearly all black that to be called a Libyan man black be merely an overblown conjecture. Sorry. All black that to be called a Libyan man black. How or when Libyans were transformed into a white race is not certain. May be merely an overblown conjuncture of Eurocentric writers. For an instance, a book of the beginnings, Volume 1, Gerald Massey explains that the Egyptian word tamahu or tamahu, a term designating Libyans in the ancient Egyptian language, literally means created white people, lending credence to the probability that ancient Libyans were albinoids, more than likely originally black-skinned people from Egyptian origin, but rejected and cast out of Egyptian, Ethiopian, or Cushitic societies because of the unseemly complexions. Diop, for instance, cites Herodotus, who states that to the Egyptians, the Libyans remained on the lowest rung of civilization. The aforementioned regarding the whiteness of the ancient Libyans does not necessarily connect them with the Caucasoids of Eurasia. It was presented to demonstrate that a mass depigmentation or albinization of people need not be brought out by a cold, sun-starved environment. As most theories regarding the evolution of Caucasoids suggest, North Africa offered abundant heat and sunlight, yet somehow albinism was triggered in a black-skinned population. As well as in Eurasia, where the emergence of Caucasoid peoples is generally thought to have occurred, something disrupted or interfered with ancient men's genes to the point where 1 in every 2 babies born was albino. A shock to early humans who had seen no other complexion than black or brown or dark brown skin. This disorder, this contagion, must have continued for several centuries, perhaps a millennium or two, with albinos being separated, kept far away from the societies of the normals to somehow limit its spread. Albinos might have been killed or else were taken or driven far away, left to fend for themselves without the accoutrements of village life, a sturdy hut, a warm fire, tribal protection, and the love of family and relatives. Ancient black peoples may have had a name for the distant, uncultivated, lonely expanse of territory or territories, since there were probably several smaller ones. They were banishing infected members too, but the name is unknown. But the largest of these territories where albinos from Asia, the Near East, and Europe were taken to be to and abandoned, that expanse of territory of the Caucasus mountain range between the Black and Caspian Seas is the area that most scholars believe Caucasians or white people emanated from, the Great White Forest. The reader may consider what follows speculation, but it is no more or less speculative than other theories on man's origins and divergence into differing types or races. While Western scholars have liberally opened on man's origins and divergence, they have been reticent on the origin of white people, except for the above mentioned commonly accepted cold climate theory, even though most have grudgingly come to accept that man's origins was Africa and the mother continent. Although the Eurocentric historian offer long-winded assertions about racial origins and races emanating from such and such racial group, they have not detailed the origin of Caucasoids. They present Caucasoids as if they were always here, eternal denizens of Europe or Eurasia, eventually invading this or that territory to produce such and such people who then became ostensibly Caucasian, allegedly. No explanation required as to specific Caucasian origins. In the view of this omission, what is presented below is tempered by an honest desire to account for the development and expansion of white-skinned people, taking into consideration human longings, maternal instinct, and survival imperatives that our species has exhibited throughout our existence. The reader is asked to take a few long, deep breaths, relax, and allow his or her mind to drift back in time. Considering what was outlined above, almost nothing would have been more distressing to ancient black humans than to produce children with colorless complexions, blonde or whitish hair, and light-colored eyes. Such children would have been extremely abnormal, considered diseased, cursed, and the children and possibly the parents would have been quarantined and all banished to limit the spread of the contagion. If, say, one of every 2 or 3 children born to parents were afflicted with this disorder, albinism, banished, taken, would have been soon so prevalent that afflicted children and perhaps their parents would have been banished, taken hundreds of miles away to remote areas and deposited in them during seasonal hunting expeditions or migrations. It is difficult to imagine mothers voluntarily abandoning their children, whatever their condition is, whatever their condition. So it is reasonable to assume that many black, Grimaldi, Australoid, or Mongoloid mothers accompanied their albino children to these areas and stayed with them at least until they were older and able to fend for themselves. The mothers themselves may have been banished along with the albino children and perhaps their normal black-skinned offspring to white forest areas where they would live out the remainder of their lives. It is not reasonable to assume that some hundreds accompanied their their wives and children to these territories where the number of albinos would have become numerous after many centuries or millennia or two of intermarrying with other albinos to produce albino children when the number of individuals with similarly defective genes increase. True Vikings, page 18. And our mean says, along with the indignity of banishment, a sense of alienation developed in those albinoids because of the rejection they felt over the impulsion over the expulsion, from the company of the tribe or society. Dr. Francis Cress Rosen in the ISIS papers lists a number of attendant manifestations of alienation developing, such as child abuse, psychosis, suicide, neurotic depression, delinquency, psychosomatic disorder, prejudice. Over the centuries, a hatred towards blacks developed because albinoids or whites could not redeem the black coloring they had lost and return to the societies that rejected them. So they began to despise all people of color according to Dr. Welsing. The destructive and aggressive behavioral patterns displayed throughout the world by white people towards all known white people is evidence of the inner hate, hostility, and rejection they feel towards themselves and of the deep self-alienation that has evolved from their genetic inadequacy, which Welsing states that this is why black males' testicles were the body parts that white males attacked in most lynchings. The testicles stole powerful color producing genetic material. The process that Welsing calls reaction conversion was the psychological mechanism that transferred the white self-hatred into hatred for blacks. This must be the reason why white scholars have done everything possible to diminish or ignore the evidence that true men evolved in Africa and established the earliest civilizations. They would rather give Asia the credit because we have been conditioned into believing that Asians were generally much light-skinned than Africans, and there is more evidence of whites in ancient times mingling their blood with Asians and in Asian territories than with blacks in Africa. Western historians have been asserted that ancient generally have even asserted that ancient Asian peoples, Hyksos, Babylonians, Sumerians, and others were Caucasians, Aryans, whites, and mainly because whites intermingled with the predominantly black populations in these territories. Diop and a few other historians theorize that the Chinese were produced from a mixing of early Caucasoids and Asiatic blacks. Although I have yet to hear of any historian calling the Chinese Caucasians white black-skinned Asians as early Asia's earliest inhabitants may have absorbed Caucasian blood. Whites, true white, behave with savage, negative aggression in Asia as well as Africa when they became powerful enough to seriously encroach on the territories within the continents. And some, as stated by Welsing, the white personality in the presence of color can be stabilized only by keeping blacks and other non-whites in obviously inferior positions. The situation of mass proximity to blacks is intolerable to whites because blacks are inherently more than equal always in the presence of color. Whites will feel genetically inferior. However, the people we know as Caucasians or whites evolved. Their numbers were burgeoning during the numbers were burgeoning during the late Neolithic in the Great White Forest area, the eastern Poland, from eastern Poland into southern Russia, north of the Caucasus Range. The eastern limit was probably the Ural Mountains, and on the western and eastern fringes of this territory, whites must have eventually had some contact with the towns and trade routes of their black skin and now distant relatives, acquiring better tools, weapons, clothing, and other implements from them, which improved the lives of a relatively small number. The great masses of them lived in desperate privation in rude hovels or cavasites where squalor and disease abundant. Around 10,000 BC, northern Europe and Asia saw the retreat of warm glacial ice, and swampy expanses stretched from modern-day Poland into Russia. And while most scholars agree that that Neanderthals had completely died out by 35,000 years ago, it is probable that many of these pre-Grimaldian humans still lingered in Eurasia, perhaps 250,000 years ago, having lost their original dark pigmentation, and that Grimaldi albinoids driven into the Great White Forest intermingled extensively with remaining Neanderthals, since opines Michael Bradley in the Iceman Inheritance, the Neanderthals very recently occupied the part of the world which is the cradle of the Caucasoid race, and the most extreme Neanderthals occupy the part of the world which has produced the most extreme manifestations of Caucasoid aggression. Bradley places most of his Caucasoid cradle in Western Europe, present-day France and Germany, which does not negate the existence of several relatively small white forest areas in addition to the Great White Forest of Eurasia. Subject that will be that subject will be revisited later in this work. Satisfied that Cro-Magnon were Caucasoids, Western scholars are completely silent about how they developed the how they how as how to as to how they developed their most regurgitated explanation being the long millennia they spent in the colder climate of Europe and the need to absorb more vitamin D because of reduced sunlight or less intense UV rays which sunlight provides. In the face of evidence and DNA research that all human beings had an African origin, modern scholars speculate on the development of Caucasoids out of black-skinned people, seem to infer that the primary difference between blacks and Caucasian is the loss of melanin in the Caucasian, and according to some, the Caucasians' higher intelligence, allegedly. Alleged higher intelligence, okay? Now, I know you're gonna get in the comments and be mad, but the intelligence is alleged. In fact, But, pardon, lost my way out there, brothers, so sorry. But there are physical differences that need to be considered, indications that Caucasoids are not merely depigmented blacks with superficial differences in hair texture, eye color, and nostril width. There are differences in skull shape and in physiognomy. Caucasians possessing more pronounced chins, less prominent cheekbones, and brow ridges. Their frontal lobes, foreheads, are generally higher, and Caucasian males are more thickly built, with generally thicker waistlines, larger calves, ankles, and wrists than blacks. And other non-whites, they are generally more hirsute, with longer body hair, often covering the arms, backs, buttocks, chests, and legs of males. The reader have not to consult would not have to consult scientific text to find that these observations are accurate. Neanderthal man was reputedly large-limbed, hirsute, and extremely aggressive, and while scholars have long asserted that Neanderthals and humans never interbred, that humans advancing into Europe killed them off, recent evidence has emerged to contradict that long-held belief. In an article published in USA Today, Neanderthals and humans interbred fossils indicate on 7th May 2010, another author Dan Vergano reports that the new DNA fossil analysis reveals that, and I quote, people of European and Asian descent inherited a small amount, an average of 1% to 4% of their genes from the extinct species. Samples from the bones of 3 Neanderthals who lived 38,000 to 45,000 years ago were compared with the genetic background of 5 living humans from different parts of the world, and the report was published in the journal Science. Not consulted for this work, the science report revealed that Neanderthals and Africans last shared an ancestor 500,000 years ago, but Neanderthals were still present in Europe and in the Near East as late as 30,000 years ago. So it is quite probable that Africans migrating into the Near East and Asia and Europe beginning 100,000 years ago, encountered remaining Neanderthals who were not markedly different from Homo sapiens in a National Geographic article entitled Last of the Neanderthal by Stephen S. Hall. October 2008, the author quotes Ed Green, head of biomathematics in Leipzig study group, who states, we know that the human and chimpanzee gene sequences are 98.7% the same, and the Neanderthal are much closer to us than chimps. So the reality is that most of the sequence, there is no difference between Neanderthals and modern humans. The size of the Neanderthal brain um, are matched our own. Neanderthals and modern humans, the size of the Neanderthal brain matched our own, so the demise of this species of human may have come out for relatively insignificant reasons like modern man's ability to effectively adapt to new or changing situations, according to Kate Wong in Scientific America article entitled Twilight of the Neanderthals, August 2009. Wong notes that studies estimating the metabolic rates of Neanderthals conclude that they required significantly more calories to survive than modern humans did. Although humans were essentially hunter-gatherers, they adapted to the changing circumstances of their environments and were able to incorporate plants and grains into their diet and out-competed Neanderthals simply by virtue of being more fuel efficient, using less energy for baseline functions, meant that moderns could devote more energy to reproducing and ensuring that the survival of their young. Wong. The last known Neanderthal, according to evidence so far uncovered, lived in the seaside caves at the southern tip of Gibraltar, southern Iberia, 28,000 years ago, long after Grimaldi man had entered and occupied Europe. However, this writer is certain that evidence of the continued existence in Eurasia and elsewhere until at least as late and later than 28,000 years ago will emerge, as well as evidence of a higher percentage of intermingling between Neanderthals and humans. My humble suggestion is that the albunoid outcast of the ancient black-skinned humans, Grimaldis, Australoids, or layer types, were driven away or banished to white forest regions where bands of Neanderthals were still present. Early contact might have been contentious affairs, Neanderthals fighting to hold on to their diminishing territories, rejected albunoids trying to secure territories for themselves because they could not return to their black-skinned tribes and societies. Neanderthals aggressive may have been aggressive enough to, in their dwindling numbers, to rout some albunoid groups from some areas, perhaps kidnapping a number of them, especially females, in fierce skirmishes throughout white forest areas. It is unlikely albunoid males would have found Neanderthal women attractive and wholesome enough to mate with. Neanderthals would not have paid a lot of attention to hygiene and cleanliness, and the stench of the abodes would have been extremely offensive to those albunoids who may have remembered the more civilized life of their tribes and villages, and who in fact had brought the higher civilization of their fate. And it is more likely the earliest interbreeding between the two groups would have taken place between Neanderthal men and albunoid women. However, men being the way they are, it is not unlikely that albunoid men impregnated Neanderthal women as well. It remains to be discovered how widely spread interbreeding was between the two groups, but they will likely be found to have been interbred more extensively than current data has so far received. In The Iceman Inheritance, author Michael Bradley, writing before the DNA technology was developed, referring to Caucasians as Neanderthal Caucasoids, suggests that humans and Neanderthals mated far more extensively than it is generally thought. And he unremorsably decries Caucasian aggression, stating, "It seems reasonable to suppose that we Caucasoids are an identifiable group because of the primitive and bestial physical characteristics we inherit throughout Neanderthal genetic input. If the Neanderthals were originally somewhat closer to apes as relatively primitive hominoid, it might be justified to speculate that our Caucasoid aggression may mirror the ape's lower frustration tolerance. While Bradley does not discuss man's African origins, seemingly to infer a European origin for Caucasians, the reader has been presented with sufficient evidence demonstrating that Africa was the cauldron out of which modern man emerged, agreeing with Bradley that humans interbred far more extensively with Neanderthals than is currently believed. I suggest, along with others mentioned above, the rejected and banished albinoids interbreeding with still existing Neanderthals, primarily in the Great White Forest areas, but in smaller White Forest areas in Europe and Asia, as well as evolved into the people we call Caucasians. Albinoid Grimaldis would have had more advantage lang- advan- more Albinoid Grimaldis would have had a more advanced language than Neanderthal sewing and tool making skills, more efficient weapon making skills and implements. Neanderthals would have been more familiar with terrain, better adapted to a colder climate, knew the seasonal migrations of the various animals they hunted for food and clothing, although it might have taken 100 generations and numerous forest skirmishes. A co-sensing of the two groups, considering an increase in albinoid Neanderthal types through interbreeding would have been beneficial to both tribes. To both tribes would form and interbreed, who would have produced albino Neanderthal offspring whose women were more pleasing to the eyes of albinoid males, making interbreeding more commonplace, while purer Neanderthal types continued to die off. However, Neanderthal genes and traits had been passed down to this emerging Caucasoid race whose development continued at a slower pace in white forest areas because contact with their now distant black-skinned ancestors and relatives was essentially severed, while their existence was not unknown to ever-expanding Grimaldi, Africoid, or Egyptian peoples continuing their migration to various parts of Earth. There was no concern for the rejected progeny, and civilization in the Pearl-Negroid belt of mankind from Spain to India and beyond would continue to advance without them. True Myth, page 21. Moving forward to about 12,000 years ago, Eurocentric scholars make a case for a Caucasian presence in Europe for designating the population of southern Europe from Spain to the Balkans. Brunette people, Iberians, Mediterraneans, or dark whites, or Wells refers to them in the Outline of History, Volume 1, the Mediterranean or Iberian division of the Caucasian race. However, in his very next sentence, Wells states it is very hard to define its southward boundaries from the Negro. Not to single out Wells for his outline of of history seems to have been honestly intended, but his attempt to establish a white presence in the southern half of Europe is a typical Eurocentric historian. Is a typical of Eurocentric historians who discuss ancient Europeans. They insert a Caucasian race in Europe, finding whiteness in people living in a wide and expanse of territory whom they refer to by nomenclatures, inferring blackness, brunette people, and the oxymoronic dark whites. Brunette, of course, implies brown or blacks, as any decent dictionary will reveal. Mediterranean and Iberian are geographic terms but are applied to the same people. At least, well, Wells at least intimated or insinuated that these southern Europeans were Negroid, or extremely close to the quote unquote Negro in appearance. But by insisting these southern Europeans were Caucasian, and and through repetition in serious publications over 2 or more centuries, Eurocentric scholars placed Caucasian in southern and western and, and far earlier than they Eurocentric scholars placed Caucasians in southern and western Europe far earlier than they arrived, along with the claims that Cro-Magnon was Caucasian, established Europe as an exclusively white continent that blacks have never inhabited. Most high school and college history texts begin ancient history with an overview of the pre-Hellenic world, a chapter about ancient Egypt, a chapter about Sumer or Mesopotamia with an insinuation that the populations of these areas were not black-skinned or negroid, but Asian and Caucasian, thereby whitening both the people and their achievements. They never say that the ancient Egyptians were black. They insinuate an Asian connection and disassociate Egypt from black African to the south, thereby disconnecting Egypt from the African continent in many readers' minds. Then follow a couple of chapters espousing Greek architecture, philosophy, art, mythology, profiles of Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, culminating in the conquest of Alexander the Great. And I just want to say one thing before I carry on about Alexander the Macedonian. Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato were all so-called black men. Now you can research busts of all these men, or you can research the Arabic depiction in the 7th century or 6th century of Socrates and of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. That's in the Arabic Museum, or was, and it's an art depiction of the philosopher Aristotle as a black man, and white version, or white looking, Arabic looking, modern Arabic looking Alexander the Great. You go search these things up and see if I'm wrong before you go comment here. Laying a cloak of whiteness over Greece, Egypt, and the whole area of the greater Ethiopia discussed in the first chapter, and the accompanying map depicting Alexander's empire at its greatest extent leaves the impression in the reader's mind that all the inhabitants living within this vast territory were Caucasian. A fuller examination of the evidence not offered in school or college texts clearly demonstrates that the Greeks did not bring civilization to the world, not even the Western world, and raises serious questions as to their supposed whiteness regarding the early Greeks. Wells informs us the Hellenic tribes, the Greeks, conquered and largely destroyed conquered and largely destroyed the Aegean civilization that preceded their arrival. Upon its ashes, they built up a civilization of their own. The Aegean civilization Wells refers to were composed of the essentially black and dark-skinned people Eurocentric historians styled Iberians, Mediterraneans, brunettes, and dark whites nomenclatures intended to disguise the fact that black and dark-skinned Africoid peoples were predominant in Europe as well as Greece at the onset of the historical era, starting from 2000 BC. So an older, highly civilized people or peoples was supplanted by what Wells says barbaric Greek herdsmen raiders who overrun the area, a point where we will revisit in more detail further on. For now, the reader should understand that a highly advanced civilization or civilizations had flourished in Greece on many of its islands and in Crete long before the Hellenes, barbaric Caucasian Greeks flooded the area. Wells further informs us shipping and agriculture, walled cities, and writing were already there. The Greeks did not grow a civilization of their own. They wrecked one. I want to say, I want to clear this up because I'm not sure if the writer in the book is going to clear this up. But while we're here, while they're talking about the Greeks, when they're mentioning the so-called Greeks that destroyed civilization or that would end up destroying civilization, or at least the type of person they're trying to make us imagine, they're talking about the Macedonian who was considered barbaric in eyes of Greek men. Okay? It wasn't until Philip II, he was the father of Alexander, that kind of brought the surrounding Greeks around to not seeing them as super barbarics, with many opportunities of, joining them in battle when they needed help. Caucasian Greeks flooded the area. Wells further informs us shipping and agriculture, walled cities, and writing were already there. The Greeks did not grow a civilization of their own. They wrecked one and put another together upon and out of the ruins. At first, they lived in open villages outside the ruins of the cities they had destroyed, but there stood the model for them, a continual suggestion. The the contention the contention is of the works of this work is that the Africoid peoples, many of them Egyptian, made up the preponderant population in Europe, especially Western and Southern Europe. These populations had inhabited Europe for millennia before invading Caucasoids, pouring out the Great White Forest in Eurasia. laid low their civilization just as barbaric Greeks largely destroyed the Aegean civilization flourishing around the eastern Mediterranean and Aegean seas, beginning in 1500 BC or a little before. There are a few more foothills to climb before heading north to Scandinavia about the Vikings. But when we arrive there, the reader will have been provided with enough evidence of black-skinned people in Europe to understand their presence in the northern reaches of the continent, which Eurocentric historians have always asserted was the domain of blonde, blue-eyed Caucasian populations. If the reader understands that the first modern human beings anywhere originated in and migrated out of Africa, that they was black-skinned and moved into Europe over the Iberian and Italian land bridges, quite obvious migration routes that Eurocentric historians and DNA researchers are reluctant to discuss. It should It should not be a shock that the earliest populations of Italy, Spain, Austria, Britain, France, and the Balkans were black-skinned and Afropoid. Also, never mentioned is that Alexander's empire lasted barely a dozen years, or that black-skinned Indians chased his army out of India and into Afghanistan, where dark-skinned Afghanis sent it reeling back to the west. They don't talk about that boy like that. They don't put dirt on that boy when the dirt is already out there. That his army in the Hindu Kush region was nearly destroyed by a cold frostbite that killed many of his troops, and that Alexander died in Babylon and not making it back to Greece alive. The only part of Alexander's empire to endure for a time was in Egypt, where the Ptolemies would rule for 3 centuries from 332 to 30 BC, building the city of Alexandria as their capital. Greece is touted as the first Western civilization, but was at one time lauded as the first ever civilization, or so it seemed from the way it was presented in history books of the first half of the 20th century. But even then, more honest historians were emerging, and a fuller examination of the evidence clearly demonstrates that the Greeks did not bring civilization to the world, not even the Western world. Look for that money, man. Look what the money make a Greek do. Our understanding of the prehistoric and historic populations of Europe, the belief that these populations were white-skinned, are based largely on the fact that whites dominate the continent today. The popular, more accessible historical works insist that whites have occupied Europe from Paleolithic times to the present. All the more recent historical peoples of Europe, Gauls, Celts, Goths, Bretons, Slavs, Etruscans, Iberians, Lombards, Danes, and such were white by implication, and very little, if anything, is mentioned regarding the possibility that the above-mentioned peoples, perhaps all, were black-skinned or non-Caucasian. So when we look at a historical atlas of Europe with these peoples and others splashed across the European landscape, we assume that all of them were Caucasian, Iranian, or Aryan, or white based on what most historical works have left us to imply. These histories are strengthened by the attendant scientific claims that blacks or dark-skinned peoples could not have flourished in the colder climates of Europe, especially northern regions in ancient and modern Britons. Hey, hey, shout out to that man McRitchie, David McRitchie, in Ancient and Modern Britons by David McRitchie. However, a work published in 1884, David McRitchie informs us that the Picts, who inhabited areas of Britain and Scotland when the Romans invaded what would become England, were blackamoors. The Picts are often referred to as the painted people in many histories, designated so by the Romans because they supposedly tattooed their entire bodies, or more commonly heard painted themselves blue. But the general assumption is that the Picts were Caucasian people, which even more modern histories have made no effort to correct. McRitchie and a handful of other historians of the Picts wrote of the Picts being blackamoors, black-skinned men, as far back as the early 19th century. Yet a modern work like The Picts and the Scots by Lloyd and Jenny Lang, a work published in 1998, makes no mention of race, leaving the reader to assume, as Eurocentric writers have habitually hoped we would, that the people being discussed were Caucasian, since of course Europe has always been inhabited by Caucasians. Allegedly. You know, you have to keep it out there. Shout out to that boy. You have to say allegedly because, you know, when it comes to that part of history, I like to say everything is alleged too. Just like someone in the comment is going to say everything we're saying from this book that we're reading out of, we're making up, or that it's alleged. But neither assumption is true. And at the beginning of chapter 7 of his work, McRitchie poses the question, could they, Black Picts, have been related to the Scandinavians as some Avor? He goes on to cite a Mr. Kitely, who states that the Picts were akin to the Scandinavians, and Mr. Martin, who states it is generally acknowledged that the Picts were originally Germans, and particularly from that part of it bordering upon the Baltic Sea. In the Picts we are speaking about a people who occupied the northern half of Britain's main island, long prior to the Romans' invasion, which commenced in 43 AD. That's 10 years after the death of who people called Jesus Christ, Yahweh Shai Hamashiach, you know, Yahweh Shai Hamashiach Hosanna, you know, my Lord and my King. How long they had lived there is unknown. How long they had lived there is unknown. But there is no mention of any people occupying northern Britain prior to the Picts, and if, as above mentioned, they were known as Germans and crossed to Britain from northern Germany, it would seem that Germany, i.e. the territory that would be known as Germany, was home to the bulk of these black-skinned people, who were related to Scandinavians, which also raises questions regarding the Germans the Romans fought against when they invaded the area of the Rhine in 133 BC. There were other tribes and peoples in the British Isles who are described as black or dark-skinned by a handful of historians and scholars who, like McRitchie, published books and articles which defied the 19th century trend of ignoring the presence of blacks in Europe. Their views must have been extremely unpopular, a time when the enslavement of Africans by Europeans and Americans was several centuries old, and popular historical and scientific works were claiming that blacks, Negroes, Sub Saharan Africans, African Americans were inferior to whites. The belief that Negroids were intrinsically inferior to whites would expand to all peoples of color: East Indians, Chinese, Melanesians, Australians, people of color anywhere. In the European mind, as European countries, having grown militarily and economically powerful, continue to pursue policies of colonialism and imperialism within territories of black and dark-skinned peoples around the world. The mass of humanity we have come to know as Caucasians developed in the white forest areas, perhaps in two areas in both Western Europe and Asia, and in the great white forest of Eurasia. Described above, the initially albinoid human rejects shunted into these areas probably mingled more extensively with declining Neanderthal populations, still inhabiting them than current data suggests. Michael Bradley, The Iceman Inheritance, published in 1978, wrote of such interbreeding between Neanderthal and Caucasians, not Homo sapien albinoids. During a time when the scientific world considered such mating biologically impossible, more than a decade before DNA science was developed, Bradley contends that certain Neanderthal traits were passed on to Caucasoids, the most significant being the characteristic we call aggression. Going on to state, I find it difficult to believe that any objective observer, or even subjective one, viewing the world's history can deny that there is this difference between Caucasoids and other kinds of men. Both Michael Bradley and Dr. Francis Cress Welsing detail the psychological causes of the aggressive nature of Caucasians, Welsing more particularly in the Caucasian behavior towards blacks and peoples of color, which will be made more clearly obvious further on. For now, let us understand that several millennia of interbreeding between albinoids and Neanderthals, normal or black-skinned humans, may also have entered the mix, eventually brought about the evolution of the Caucasian race that Diop believes emerged 20,000 years ago to the south and west of the Great White Forest. The civilization of normals, black Africoid civilization, was expanding in its most dynamic aspects, spreading outward from the northeastern quadrant of Africa. Caucasoids confined to the Great White Forest and smaller forest areas languished in a deprived, barbaric state, bereft of anything that could be called civilization. Even 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, there is no evidence to show that the general condition of Caucasoids had changed, but some other areas of the Great White Forest, outer fringes, would begin to come into tenuous contact with civilized people as the expanding proto-Negroid belt of humanity spread and their population increased. Venturing beyond their own overcrowded confines, the Great White Forest inhabitants skulked near enough to glimpse passing caravans of better-dressed, confident, laughing, black-skinned people journeying to unknown destinations. These people would have seemed almost godlike in their flowing, colored raiment, driving flocks of sheep and goats and cattle, and flanked by shepherds, keeping the animals in order. Great white forest tribes eyed them from safe distances, hunger pangs and stabbing their guts whenever they thought about sinking their teeth into a fleshly lamb. While they fought the impulse to change into the procession and make off with one or two animals and escaping back into the hills where they watched and slicing into the flesh of the beast with their crude implements. They knew their crude stone hand axes could bash the skulls and bodies of animals owners, but they knew the black men in the caravan had dangerous weaponry, long thin spikes with sharp penetrating tips that could be hurled long distances, penetrate their bodies, leave them with writhing in leave them writhing in agony, unable to pull them out without more pain or even death. The fleet-footed strangers would run them down and pierce them with short black spikes sharper than any substance they knew. They had witnessed the deaths of bolder tribe members who had grabbed a small animal and tried to flee with it and did not want to suffer the same fate. So most of the time they watched the dark strangers in awe until they passed out of view, wondering where they were going and when the next procession would pass by. They envied the strangers, sometimes imitating the strangers' gaits of the black man, sometimes imitating the strutting gaits of the black man they had seen when they returned to their village, to the amusement of the tribe members, but mostly they seethed with anger. Gradually they approached closer and to the stranger processions, waved at the people in it, who sometimes waved back, but more often ran threateningly at them, chasing them back into the hills where they lived. But sometimes, driven by hunger and their sorry state, they approached the haughty black-skinned stranger and begged by sign and gesture for food, clothing, sometimes weapons, sometimes offering their young daughters or sons to them for something that would make their lives more bearable. Even when the strangers offered to trade a cow or food or weapon for a few young children or animal hides, the white-skinned barbarian fumed when the initial exuberance of a newly acquired possession abated. Then a feeling of hatred for the strangers would consume them. Back in their lairs, even they enjoyed the notoriety. Their daring contact with the passing black strangers brought them back in their villages. When night fell, the faces of the daughters or sons they had traded for food or their new possessions drifted starkly into their minds. They remembered the looks of utter bewilderment in the children's eyes as they were led away by the strangers, by the way they kept looking back, believing their fathers would gesture for them to come back and that the strangers would simply release them. Then in the dark of the black-skinned strangers, even more for agreeing sorry, then in the dark of the lairs of men would scream out in the night of out in the night hating themselves, hating what they did, but hating the black skinned stranger even more for agreeing for such a bargain. But they had more children to feed, and besides the few furs and trinkets they could manage to part with, they had nothing more valuable to trade than all the children whom they knew would be living in improved circumstances and in hardships they might have to endure. Maybe one day they would come back. Hatred toward the black skinned strangers persisted, even though the next year or the year after they would approach another caravan and trade more furs and trinkets, more children receiving in return a few goats or sheep, a cow, a few wondrous weapons, tipped by the black strangers called metal, tipped by what the black strangers called metal, or implements to stitch together furs for more durable garments. Slowly, very slowly, their wretched condition improved. Less of them died of hunger and disease, and the birth rate improved because black female strangers had told the women about cleanliness and isolation from the group and given them herbs to ease childbirth, most waiving off any trade goods in return, even though these were offered. Even so, they could not shake a general feeling of anger toward these black-skinned people, believing in their souls that the possession of these blacks was somehow owed to them, should be given without recompense, because the blacks had so much. Great white forest dwellers were unbearable the to rid their minds of the unexplained abhorrence and anger they held toward the black strangers. One day they thought, often telling other men in their tribe or group what they felt. One day, this feeling of ill will gradually spread throughout the Great White Forest. Over the centuries, Great White Forest tribes moved about and mingled with other tribes, and eventually, as news of black strangers and incredible towns far to the south spread throughout most of the Great White Forest, reported by tribe members who had followed a caravan to its destination at a safe distance, or maybe by a few trade or maybe by a few traded children who eventually returned. As adults, a burning question gnawed at the minds of the more aggressive denizens. Why can't we have all the things the black strangers have? And that was it for chapter 2. You know, that was it for chapter 2. Um, I wanna move on. Well, Kate, you can stop recording, but I wanna move on to like